At my annual garden party, I publicly shamed Earl Briggs for ruining my prize-winning rosebush. "You're fired!" I bellowed, watching the old gardener wilt. Hours later, I found him still dawdling, packing his meager things. "Move it!" I snapped, grabbing a box. His son Glenn lunged to protect him. In the sudden scramble, Glenn's old canvas bag flew open, scattering its contents onto my pristine patio. Before I continue, drop a comment telling me where you're listening to this from, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss the ending. Harold McAllister liked mornings best in his Atlanta mansion. The quiet hum of the high-end appliances in the kitchen, the gentle rustle of leaves from his meticulously manicured gardens, and the way the Georgia sun, still a soft yellow, kissed the polished mahogany of his study. He'd built McAllister Hardware from one small storefront into a regional powerhouse, and he saw his sprawling estate as the physical proof of his sharp mind and tireless work. Every acre, every rosebush, every single custom-made piece of furniture whispered of his success. And in his world, success meant respect, and more importantly, it meant control. He sat on the veranda, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand, scanning the financial pages. The coffee was exactly as he liked it, strong and black, delivered without a word by Phyllis, his housekeeper of 10 years. He barely looked up when she placed the cup on the small table beside him, already anticipating the precise angle, the steady hand. He knew her routine better than she did, he often thought. Her footsteps, soft and practiced, receded, and he only registered her presence as an absence. Not a person, just a function smoothly executed. He'd once considered replacing her because she left a small smudge on a crystal vase in the drawing room. A smudge he had to point out, of course. But her efficiency, her quiet disappearing act, usually kept her safe. He just expected things to be perfect, always. A buzzing vibration from his phone on the table announced a call from one of his store managers, Dale Henderson. Harold took a slow sip of coffee before answering, letting it ring twice. "McAllister," he stated, his voice clipped. Dale, bless his heart, started immediately with an apology about a late shipment of lumber to the Gainesville store. Harold cut him off mid-sentence. "Dale, I don't pay you to tell me about problems. I pay you to solve them. Lumber means sales, sales mean profit. You think I got where I am by accepting excuses? Figure it out, or I'll find someone who can." He didn't wait for a reply, simply hung up. He didn't dislike Dale, not really. He just had no patience for weakness. It was a dog-eat-dog world, and if you weren't eating, you were being eaten. He had no room for sentimentality in business or in life. He pushed himself up from the veranda chair, stretching his back. He enjoyed a morning walk through his gardens, a tour of his kingdom. Every hedge trimmed, every flower bed bursting with color, every blade of grass exactly the right length. He paid top dollar for this perfection, and he expected nothing less. Rounding the corner past the formal rose garden, he saw him, Earl Briggs. The old man was hunched over a particularly stubborn patch of weeds, his faded denim jacket blending into the green. Earl had been his head gardener for 15 years. 15 years. Harold couldn't remember a single conversation they'd ever had beyond instructions and monosyllabic confirmations. Earl was just there, like the fountains or the old oak trees. A fixture. He knew Earl showed up every morning, rain or shine, and kept the grounds immaculate. He often thought of Earl as a kind of human automaton, programmed to prune and plant, never speaking, never complaining. Just working. Harold didn't know his last name until a few years ago when his assistant had to fill out a new payroll form. Briggs. Earl Briggs. He certainly didn't care to know anything else. The old man just silently dug and tended, blending into the landscape of Harold's perfect, untouchable world. Harold gave a dismissive flick of his wrist, a silent command that Earl, whose back was to him, wouldn't even see, before continuing his walk, already mentally ticking off items on his mental to-do list. The rose garden was looking particularly vibrant this year, thanks to his careful selection of varietals, of course. Earl Briggs, at 84 years old, moved with a slowness that belied his endurance. His hands, gnarled and stained from a lifetime spent in soil, still held a surprising gentleness. He knew every plant on the McAllister estate as if it were an old friend, and certainly better than Harold himself. The rose garden was his particular pride, not just the showy hybrids that Harold valued for their prestige, but the wilder, older varieties nestled in corners where few ever looked. He could tell by the color of a leaf, the angle of a new shoot, exactly what a plant needed. Water, sun, a trim, or just to be left alone. 15 years he'd been here, shaping and tending, a silent observer of the life unfolding in the grand house. He knelt now, carefully turning the soil around a bed of azaleas near the back patio, getting them ready for their early summer bloom. The morning sun was growing warmer, and sweat beaded on his brow, trickling down the deep lines etched around his eyes. He didn't mind the heat. He didn't mind the work. It was honest work, and it kept him close, always close. Harold McAllister stepped out onto the patio, his voice cutting through the peaceful hum of the morning like a sharp knife. "Earl, are you deaf? I've been calling your name for 5 minutes." Earl slowly straightened up, his back protesting, but he didn't wince. He turned to face Harold, his expression neutral, his faded blue eyes meeting Harold's sharp gaze. "Morning, Mr. McAllister," he said, his voice a low rumble, worn smooth like river stones. Harold, still in his crisp linen shirt, strode towards him, a frown marring his face. He jostled towards a patch of newly planted impatiens. "These impatiens, they look droopy. I specifically asked for the Scarlet Blaze variety. These look like common market stock. Are you sure you ordered the right ones? You know how important presentation is for the upcoming garden party." He didn't wait for an answer, didn't give Earl a chance to explain that the plants had merely been thirsty after transplanting and would perk up with a good watering. "Don't tell me you're getting too old for this, Earl. My gardener needs to be sharp, efficient, not planting whatever catches his eye." Earl just nodded, a slight inclination of his head. "They'll be fine by afternoon, Mr. McAllister. Just needed a good drink." He didn't mention he'd personally selected the strongest, healthiest plants he could find, regardless of their fancy names, knowing they'd thrive better in the Atlanta heat. He reached for his watering can, already moving to give the impatiens the attention they required. He'd learned long ago that arguing with Harold was like trying to argue with a brick wall. It was pointless and only led to more aggravation. Better to just quietly fix whatever Harold imagined was broken. Harold, however, wasn't finished. He gestured towards the new Cadillac, parked at the end of the long, winding driveway. "And while you're at it, get that truck of yours moved. You're blocking the delivery path. My new sculpture is arriving this afternoon, and I need a clear route. It's a 6-figure piece, Earl. We can't have any mishaps." Earl's truck, an old reliable Ford pickup, was parked discreetly at the very edge of the gravel, hardly blocking anything, but Harold always seemed to find a reason to complain about its presence. Earl merely nodded again, his gaze briefly sweeping over the expensive car before returning to his watering can. "Yes, sir. I'll move it right away." There was no resentment in his voice, no defiance, just an acceptance, deep and ingrained. He finished watering the impatiens, watching as the leaves began to unfurl and regain their vibrant green. Then, without another word, he slowly pushed himself up, wiping his hands on his trousers, and began the long walk toward his weathered truck. Harold stood watching him, arms crossed, until the old man was out of sight, before turning back to inspect his perfectly ordered world. Earl, meanwhile, climbed into his truck, the worn leather of the steering wheel familiar beneath his hands. He started the engine, the rumble a comforting thrum, and slowly, carefully, moved the vehicle a few extra feet down the road, away from the grand entrance away from Harold's view, as he had done countless times before. Just another day, just another small dismissal. The week leading up to Harold McAllister's annual garden party was always a whirlwind of activity, and Harold was at the center of it, a demanding conductor orchestrating every detail. He insisted on perfection, from the sparkle of the crystal stemware to the precise angle of every garden gnome. The McAllister hardware chain was doing exceptionally well, and this party was his chance to parade that success, to show off not just his business acumen, but his immaculate taste and his truly enviable lifestyle. Phyllis, his housekeeper, moved like a ghost through the mansion, directing caterers and florists with a quiet efficiency that still never quite met Harold's unachievable standards. "Phyllis, the peonies in the drawing room are drooping. Are you sure they're fresh?" He'd bellow, even as the flowers, barely an hour in the vase, still held their morning dew. She'd simply nod, her lips pressed into a thin line, and quietly replace them, knowing better than to argue. Joyce Bates, Harold's personal assistant, was constantly on her phone, juggling RSVPs and confirming entertainment, all under the shadow of Harold's relentless critiques. She sometimes caught Phyllis's eye across a crowded room, and in that fleeting glance, a silent understanding passed between them. A shared sigh. On Tuesday morning, 2 days before the party, Harold decided to personally inspect the rose garden, his pride and joy. He walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp eyes missing nothing. The air was thick with the sweet scent of blooming roses, a symphony of color stretching before him. But then his gaze snagged on something. Near his prize-winning Southern Belle hybrid, a bush known for its enormous velvety pink blossoms, a section looked off. It had been recently pruned, yes, but not to his liking. A few of the budding stems had been cut back, not just the spent blooms. To Harold, it looked like a sacrilege. He spotted Earl Briggs, hunched over nearby, carefully weeding around a bed of petunias. Earl's movements were slow, deliberate, each pluck of a weed a testament to decades of patient labor. "Earl!" Harold's voice ripped through the morning calm, sharp enough to make a cardinal stop its song. Earl slowly straightened up, his movements stiff, and turned to face Harold, a small trowel still clutched in his weathered hand. "Yes, Mr. McAllister?" he asked, his voice low and calm. Harold stalked over, pointing an accusing finger at the rosebush. "What in the blazes have you done to my Southern Belle? Look at this. You've butchered it. Those were perfectly good buds, Earl. Buds. This is a prize-winning varietal, not some common roadside bush you can hack at with abandon." His face was reddening, a vein throbbing in his temple. Earl looked at the bush, then back at Harold. "Mr. McAllister, I was just making sure it got proper air circulation. Some of the inner stems were getting crowded. It'll bloom stronger if we thin it a bit now." He spoke softly, without a hint of defensiveness, simply stating the horticultural truth. But Harold wasn't listening. "Air circulation? What do you know about proper air circulation for a prize rose, old man? You're a gardener, not a botanist. This rose is a statement. It's supposed to be magnificent for the party. Now it looks sparse. I hire you to maintain, not to destroy." At that moment, a delivery truck rumbled up the drive, bringing a fresh shipment of exotic orchids for the party's centerpieces. The driver, a young man named Tommy, stopped the truck and began to unload, but his eyes kept darting towards the confrontation. Phyllis, hearing the raised voices, had quietly emerged onto the back patio, ostensibly to supervise the orchid delivery, but her gaze was fixed on Harold and Earl. Even Tommy shifted uncomfortably, pretending to focus intently on the orchid crates, his shoulders hunched. Harold, now fully enraged, wasn't done. "This is precisely why I pay you to follow instructions, not to interpret them. You think you know better than me? After 15 years, you still can't prune a simple rosebush correctly? It's incompetence, Earl. Pure incompetence. You clearly don't appreciate the value of what you're working with here. He paused, his chest heaving. This is unacceptable. Utterly, completely unacceptable. Earl stood silently, his gaze dropping from Harold's furious face to the soil beneath his feet. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. I apologize, Mr. McAllister. It won't happen again. His voice was barely a whisper, an acceptance of blame, a quiet surrender. There was no argument, no plea, just a weary acknowledgement of Harold's judgment. He simply turned back to his petunias, slowly, deliberately, as if the rosebush incident had never happened, as if his own heart hadn't just been stomped on. Harold, still fuming, watched for another moment, then let out a disgusted huff and stormed back towards the house, leaving Earl to his solitary work, a silent figure in the vast, indifferent garden. The annual garden party was a roaring success. Harold McAllister surveyed the scene from his veranda, a glass of champagne in hand, a self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. Dozens of Atlanta's elite mingled on his perfectly manicured lawns, the air thick with polite laughter, clinking glasses, and the fragrant perfume of 1,000 blossoms. He'd spared no expense. The string quartet played a soft melody. The caterers moved silently among the guests offering trays of delicacies, and the evening light bathed everything in a warm, golden glow. This was his world, meticulously crafted, a testament to his power and his discerning taste. But as his gaze drifted towards the rose garden, a familiar prickle of irritation started deep in his gut. The Southern Belle rosebush, the one he'd chastised Earl about days ago, still looked wrong. To his eye, it was still sparse, a glaring imperfection in an otherwise flawless tableau. He'd decided then that he couldn't let this go. Not tonight, not when everyone was here to admire his perfect vision. Earl's quiet defiance, his simple claim that he was just making sure it got proper air circulation, still grated on Harold's nerves. It was insolence, pure and simple, and it needed to be dealt with, publicly. He spotted Earl Briggs near the edge of the property, a silent shadow in his worn uniform, tending to a small herb garden next to the kitchen entrance. Harold straightened his tie and began to walk, slowly, deliberately, towards the old man, making sure his path would lead him past several clusters of guests. Phyllis, his housekeeper, was directing a waiter nearby, while Joyce Bates, his ever-efficient assistant, was chatting with a client on the phone, but both caught Harold's eye as he approached Earl. They knew that look. Earl! Harold's voice cut through the soft murmur of conversation. A little too loud, a little too sharp. Several heads turned. Earl slowly straightened, a small dirt smudge on his cheek, his faded eyes blinking in the soft light. He looked a little lost among the finely dressed guests. "Mr. McAllister?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the string quartet. Harold stood before him, arms crossed, a cool, appraising look on his face. He didn't raise his voice, not exactly, but he projected it, making sure everyone within earshot could hear his pronouncements. "Earl, I've been observing your work, and frankly, I'm deeply disappointed. The Southern Belle Rose is still a travesty. I specifically told you what I expected, and you chose to disregard my instructions." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "It's not just that one rose, Earl. It's a pattern, a lack of attention to detail, a casual disregard for my explicit instructions. After 15 years, I expect competence, not whatever this is." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. A woman in a shimmering gown looked away, pretending to admire a fountain. Earl simply stood there, his hands clasped in front of him, his head slightly bowed. No anger, no defensiveness, just a quiet stillness that fueled Harold's annoyance. He'd expected an argument, an excuse, something to lash out against. But there was nothing. Just that infuriating, silent acceptance. "I've tolerated it long enough," Harold continued, his voice hardening. My estate demands excellence. My parties demand perfection. And you, Earl, are clearly no longer up to the task. He took a slow breath, his gaze sweeping over the old gardener's worn clothes, his tired face. Therefore, effective immediately, your services are no longer required. And since you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps me keep bringing stories like this. The string quartet seemed to falter for a moment, then picked up its melody with renewed vigor, as if to drown out the harshness of Harold's words. Earl remained silent, still. You're fired, Earl, Harold reiterated, driving the point home. And I won't be paying you for the last 2 weeks. Consider it compensation for the damage to my rosebush and the general decline in standards. I expect you to remove your personal effects from the garden shed by the end of the day. If anything is left here tomorrow, I'll consider it abandoned and dispose of it myself. And if you attempt to argue, I will not hesitate to pursue legal action. Earl finally raised his head, his eyes meeting Harold's for a brief, unsettling moment. There was something in those faded blue eyes Harold couldn't quite decipher. Not anger, not sadness, but a deep, weary understanding, almost a quiet pity that made Harold's own anger flare. It was like Earl was looking past him, seeing something Harold couldn't. Earl slowly, almost imperceptibly, nodded once. Yes, Mr. McAllister, he murmured, his voice as soft as a rustle of dry leaves. He turned, his movements slow but steady, and began to walk towards the small, unassuming garden shed at the far edge of the property, away from the glittering party. As he shuffled away, Harold watched him go, feeling a strange, fleeting sense of unease. For a split second, something about the old man's gait, the way his shoulders slumped, snagged at a distant memory, a flicker of something familiar. But Harold quickly dismissed it. It was just an old man, finally getting what he deserved, just a burden removed. He turned back to his guests, forcing a bright smile. More champagne, anyone? He boomed, as if nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. Earl shuffled away from the dazzling lights of Harold McAllister's garden party, the polite chatter and classical music fading behind him like a half-remembered dream. The evening air, warm and humid, felt like a blanket of quiet understanding after the sharp edge of Harold's words. He didn't rush. There was no point. His old Ford pickup, moved earlier to the far corner of the road, waited patiently. He climbed in, the springs groaning a familiar protest, and started the engine. The rumble of the old truck was a comfort, a steady, reliable heartbeat in a world that sometimes felt harsh and unpredictable. He drove slowly down the tree-lined streets of Atlanta, away from the grand estates and into the quieter, older neighborhoods, where homes were smaller, but felt, to Earl, much larger in spirit. His own house was a modest 2-bedroom bungalow, its paint peeling in places, nestled under a sprawling pecan tree. The porch light was on, casting a warm yellow glow, and Earl knew why. Glenn. His son Glenn was waiting. Glenn, a burly man in his early 50s with his father's kind eyes and strong workingman's hands, was always waiting. He ran his own small landscaping business, specializing in the kind of practical, everyday yard work Harold McAllister would never deign to acknowledge. Glenn often dropped by after his own work was done, just to check on his father, share a meal, or simply sit on the porch swing together as the fireflies began their slow dance. As Earl pulled into the driveway, Glenn emerged from the house, wiping flour from his hands on a kitchen towel. "Pop, you're late. I was just about to call the house. Everything all right?" His brow was furrowed with concern, a worry line that deepened with age. Earl offered a small, tired smile. "Everything's fine, son. Just had a bit of a talk with Mr. McAllister. My services won't be needed anymore. Come morning." He said it simply, without rancor, as if discussing the weather. He didn't mention the public humiliation, the harsh words, the dismissed wages. There was no need to burden Glenn with Harold's cruelties. Glenn's face tightened. He fired you? After all these years? That old miser? I always knew he was a cold one. He stepped forward, putting a comforting hand on his father's shoulder. Come on in, Pop. I made your favorite, chicken and dumplings. And don't you worry about a thing. You can work with me. Plenty of jobs to go around. Earl nodded, a genuine warmth spreading through him at his son's loyalty. That's good of you, Glenn. Always is. He sat down at the small kitchen table, the familiar scent of home-cooked food filling the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, catered perfection of Harold's party. Glenn placed a steaming bowl in front of him, then sat opposite, watching his father carefully. After dinner, as Glenn washed the dishes, Earl went into his small bedroom. He sat on the edge of his bed, the familiar quilt his late wife had made draped over it. His gaze fell upon a small wooden chest at the foot of the bed. He reached for it, his fingers tracing the worn carving on its lid. Inside, tucked beneath a few old letters and a faded photograph of a young woman with kind eyes, was a worn, leather-bound diary. Its cover was embossed with a faded gold EB. He picked it up, feeling the smooth, cool leather under his thumb. He didn't open it immediately. He just held it, a quiet connection in his hands. It was heavy with secrets, with memories, with a lifetime of watching. The thought of Harold's words still echoed, but holding this diary, this tangible link to a past only he knew, always brought a strange, enduring comfort. He traced the faded initials, a soft sigh escaping his lips. He'd been fired, publicly shamed, but in this small, quiet room, holding this diary, he was still a father, and that, he knew, was something Harold McAllister could never take from him. Harold woke the next morning with a dull throb behind his eyes, a souvenir from the previous night's celebratory champagne. Despite the slight hangover, he felt a surge of satisfaction. The party had been magnificent, a triumph, and getting rid of Earl, that had been a minor but necessary act of cleanup, a final sweep of the broom. He hated loose ends. He hated the idea of Earl still lingering on his property, a quiet reproach to his perfectly executed dismissal. He dressed in casual slacks and a crisp, clean white polo shirt. After a strong cup of coffee, he made his way outside, intending to do a final check of the property before his staff cleared away the last of the party remnants. The air was heavy, humid, a typical Georgia summer day threatening rain. The grounds, though still bearing signs of the party, were remarkably tidy, thanks to Phyllis and the cleanup crew. But as he neared the far corner, tucked away by the old oak, he saw a sight that immediately sent a fresh wave of irritation through him. There, by the small weathered garden shed, was Earl, and with him, a younger, burly man, Harold recognized as Earl's son, Glenn. They were slowly, painstakingly, packing Earl's few belongings into old cardboard boxes. An ancient, beat-up canvas bag, clearly belonging to Glenn, hung precariously over one of his broad shoulders, looking stuffed to bursting. Harold's jaw tightened. He'd told Earl to be gone by the end of yesterday. This lingering, this slow pace, felt like a deliberate act of defiance. "Earl, what in the blazes do you think you're doing?" Harold's voice, sharp and laced with annoyance, cut through the quiet afternoon. Both men jumped, startled. Glenn, who had been bent over a box, straightened up quickly, a protective stance already evident in his posture. Earl merely turned, his old eyes, clouded with a familiar weariness, meeting Harold's. "Just finishing up, Mr. McAllister," Earl said, his voice quiet, almost an apology. He held a small, dusty watering can, one of his personal tools, in his hand. Harold strode forward, his patience evaporating like morning mist. "Finishing up?" "I said, by the end of yesterday, Earl. Do you understand what end of the day means? It means gone. Not dawdling, not taking your sweet time." Are you intentionally trying to provoke me? He gestured dismissively at the watering can. Honestly, Earl, you're practically a fossil. Can't you move any faster? Or are you just trying to get some pity from me? Because I assure you, it won't work. He felt a perverse satisfaction in delivering the cutting words, watching Earl's shoulders slump ever so slightly. Glenn stepped forward, placing himself slightly between his father and Harold. His face was a thundercloud. He's 84 years old, Mr. McAllister. Give him a break. We're doing our best. There's not much here, anyway. Harold glared at Glenn. I wasn't speaking to you, young man. This is between me and my former employee, and not much here is beside the point. The point is, I expect my instructions to be followed. Now move along, both of you, and take that junk with you. He pointed at a small cardboard box filled with Earl's gardening gloves and a few hand tools. Without waiting, Harold reached out, his hand closing around the top of the box Earl was holding, intending to yank it away and hurry the process along. He wanted them off his property now. It happened in a blur of motion. Glenn, seeing Harold's aggressive move, reacted instinctively. Hey, don't you touch my father! He yelled, lunging forward to block Harold to protect Earl. Harold, caught off guard by the sudden intervention, stumbled backward, his grip slipping from the box. In the sudden, jarring contact, Glenn's old, overstuffed canvas workbag, which he'd slung carelessly over his shoulder, was violently knocked from its perch. It flew through the air, spinning once, then landed with a dull, heavy thud on the pristine flagstone patio at Harold's feet. The worn canvas, already frayed with age, gave way under the impact. The bag overturned, spilling its contents in a chaotic sprawl across the smooth stones. A rusty pocket knife, a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a dog-eared paperback novel, a small faded photograph of a young woman smiling, and amidst the clutter, lying face up, its pages fluttering open in the slight breeze, was a worn, leather-bound diary. Its cover, a rich, dark brown, was embossed with a faded gold E.B. Harold's eyes, still burning with indignation, snagged on it. The diary lay open, its pages filled with meticulous looping handwriting, clearly visible. It was old, aged, and it suddenly seemed to pulse with a silent, undeniable presence. Harold froze, his breath catching in his throat, his gaze, drawn by an invisible thread, fixed on the open pages. He could see dates, names, scribbled observations, and then his own name, clear as day. Harold's first steps, he read, his voice barely a whisper, an involuntary sound. He laughed so loud today, my heart nearly burst. He looked so much like his mother. The meticulous, looping handwriting, faded with time, detailed his own childhood, from his birth and early adoption, to every milestone, secret fear and triumph, all observed from a distance by a loving, broken-hearted father. The world tilted. The sounds of the lingering cleanup crew, the distant hum of traffic, the indignant cry from Glenn, all faded into a muffled roar. Harold felt a cold dread crawl up his spine, an icy hand gripping his heart. He looked up, his eyes wide and unseeing. From the diary to Earl, who stood utterly still, his face etched with an ancient sorrow. The two garden party guests who had lingered for a final drink and were discreetly watching, Joyce Bates, all had their eyes fixed on the scene, silent, stunned witnesses to the sudden shattering revelation. The faded gold E.B. on the diary's cover seemed to mock him, a cruel joke revealing a truth he had brutally ignored for a lifetime. Harold's gaze was locked on the worn, leather-bound diary. It lay open on the flagstone, its pages fanned out by the breeze, displaying meticulous, looping handwriting. The faded gold E.B. on the cover seemed to glow, a cruel spotlight on a truth he hadn't even known existed moments ago. His breath hitched. He felt a sudden, inexplicable coldness spread through his chest. chilling him from the inside out despite the humid Georgia air. His eyes scanned the delicate script, dates, events, names. And then, there it was, stark and undeniable. His own name. Harold's first steps. He read aloud, his voice raspy, barely a whisper. The words felt like a punch to the gut. He knelt, not even realizing he was doing so, his hand reaching out, trembling slightly, to steady the pages. He laughed so loud today, my heart nearly burst. He looked so much like his mother. His mind reeled, a whirlwind of confusion and a dawning, terrible dread. His first steps? His mother? He knew his adoptive parents. He knew their faces, their voices, their stories. They had always been his parents, his only parents. The wealth, the lineage, the McAllister name, all tied to them. But the handwriting, the intimacy of the observations, the sheer detail, it was impossible to dismiss. This wasn't just a random diary. This was his story, told by someone else, someone he had just publicly humiliated and fired. Harold's eyes darted from the diary to Earl Briggs, who stood motionless, his face a mask of profound sorrow, his gaze fixed on Harold with an unreadable depth. Beside him, Glenn, his son, was still fuming, ready to leap, but Harold barely registered him. It was Earl, the gardener he had treated like dirt, like a silent, interchangeable fixture for 15 years. Earl, the old man he'd scorned for a rosebush, had just stood there watching him, hearing those devastating words as this diary lay open at his feet. A flicker of memory, a vague, almost forgotten image from his earliest childhood, surfaced. A strong, calloused hand holding his, a low, gentle voice singing a lullaby, different from his adoptive mother's crisp tones. He'd always dismissed it as a childhood dream, a trick of the mind. But now the details in the diary, the specific little moments, too precise to be coincidence, began to align with those hazy fragments. His adoptive parents had told him he was adopted, of course, but always glossed over the details of his biological parents, speaking only of vague, unfortunate circumstances. He'd never pressed, never cared to know. Why would he? He was a McAllister. That was enough. He saw the faded gold EB again. Earl Briggs. EB, the initials, the meticulous looping handwriting. Familiar now, like a ghost from his past. It was undeniable. The diary wasn't just about him, it was for him. A lifetime of a father's silent watch, meticulously recorded, every milestone and memory, every secret fear and triumph, all observed from a distance by a loving, broken-hearted man. Harold looked at Earl again, truly looked at him for the very first time. Not as the gardener, not as the old man, not as the hired help. He saw the faded blue eyes, so like his own. He saw the set of the jaw, the high cheekbones beneath the weathered skin. The stoicism, the quiet acceptance, the way Earl had always simply been there. For 15 years, right here, in his garden, his father. The arrogance, the pride, the carefully constructed facade of superiority. It all began to crack, then shatter, crumbling into a pile of ash inside him. Guilt, raw and suffocating, washed over him, turning his stomach cold. Grief for a lifetime lost, for a bond denied, for the unspoken words, for the love he had thrown away, surged through him, burning his throat. He had treated his own blood, his own father, with such contempt, such casual cruelty. He had dismissed him, belittled him, fired him, all while his father had carried this silent burden, this secret history, these intimate memories of his son. The weight of it, the horrifying irony, was crushing. He, Harold McAllister, who prided himself on his sharp mind and control, had been utterly blind. Blinded by his own success, His own arrogance, his own class-based prejudice. He had walked past his father for 15 years, given him orders, paid him a wage, never once seeing the man beneath the uniform, never once sensing the hidden tie, the blood bond that connected them. He looked down at the worn, leather-bound diary, its pages still open, still fluttering. The words seemed to accuse him, to mourn the lost years, the unsaid words, the countless dismissals. He could feel the eyes of Joyce, Glenn, and the lingering party guests on him. But their judgment, their shock, meant nothing now. There was only this diary, this truth, and the silent, sorrowful face of Earl Briggs, his father. The world he had built, his perfect, ordered world, was suddenly a hollow shell, filled with nothing but the echo of his own cruelty. The worn, leather-bound diary lay open, its pages a window into a past Harold had never known. Harold's first steps. The words spun in his head, a dizzying loop that made the pristine flagstones beneath him feel unstable. His hand, which had reached to steady the diary, was now shaking uncontrollably. He looked from the faded gold EB on the cover, back to the meticulous looping handwriting detailing his own babyhood, his first laugh, the loving observations of a man he had just called a fossil. Then his gaze lifted, fixing on Earl Briggs. He saw the face of the man he'd scorned, the old man whose silence he'd interpreted as dullness, whose quiet dignity he'd crushed under the weight of his own bluster. Now he saw the lines of age around Earl's faded blue eyes, and realized they weren't just lines from sun and toil. They were etched with a lifetime of keeping a secret, a lifetime of watching his son from a distance, of enduring his contempt. "Pop?" Glenn Briggs's voice was rough with confusion and anger, but Harold barely heard him. The world outside of Earl's eyes seemed to recede, blurred and distant. You watched me?" Harold's voice was a croak, barely audible. He felt a profound, sickening lurch in his stomach. The pride, the arrogance, the carefully constructed fortress of his self-importance crumbled instantly, leaving him exposed, raw, utterly vulnerable. He had been so blind, so foolish, so monstrously cruel. He remembered the garden party just hours ago. The music, the laughter, the champagne, and his own booming voice echoing across the lawn. "Earl, what in the blazes have you done to my Southern belle? You've butchered it. You're fired, Earl, and I won't be paying you for the last 2 weeks. Consider it compensation for the damage to my rosebush and the general decline in standards." The words, so sharp and deliberate when he'd uttered them, now twisted into hot coals in his memory, burning him from the inside. He had publicly shamed his own father, refused him his due, threatened him, all over a rosebush. The triviality of his anger, set against the monumental truth now laid bare, was agonizing. A wave of nausea swept over him. He sank to his knees fully, not caring about the dirt on his expensive slacks, not caring that Joyce Bates and the other lingering guests were silent, stunned witnesses to his unraveling. His hands flew to his face, covering his eyes, but he couldn't block out the images, the memories of every dismissive flick of his wrist, every condescending remark, every moment he'd treated Earl Briggs as less than human. "Father," he choked out, the word foreign, heavy with a lifetime of absence. He lowered his hands, his eyes wet, pleading, fixed on Earl. "Earl, Father, I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know." His voice cracked, tears streaming down his face, not the dignified tears of a man of status, but the ugly, desperate sobs of a broken child. "The rosebush, the money. I fired you. I fired my own father. God forgive me. Can you ever forgive me?" Earl Briggs, who had stood stoic through so much, finally moved. His shoulders, which had always seemed to bear the weight of years and secrets with quiet strength, visibly sagged, He looked utterly exhausted, as if the burden of keeping his truth had suddenly been lifted, only to be replaced by the crushing weight of its revelation. There was no triumph in his eyes, no anger, no, "I told you so." Only a profound, ancient grief and a shimmering, undeniable flicker of love. His gaze held Harold's, and in that moment, Harold saw everything. The longing, the sacrifice, the quiet dedication. Earl's hand, gnarled and weathered, slowly, hesitantly, reached out. It didn't strike Harold, didn't push him away. Instead, it came to rest gently on Harold's shoulder, a touch that was both a comfort and a gentle rebuke. "My boy," Earl whispered, his voice thick with emotion, years of unspoken words finally finding release. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The simple touch, the single, raw word, carried all the forgiveness Harold didn't deserve, all the love he'd never known. It was a lifeline in the wreckage of his shattered world. Harold leaned into the touch, still sobbing, clinging to that fragile, precious connection. For the first time in his life, he wasn't Harold McAllister, successful businessman, ruthless titan. He was just a lost son, found at last in the arms of the man he had cast aside. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.